So back in the app we worked on, again, I have my backend opened in one window and frontend opened in another window. Now, in this project here, we want to have a look at the different API keys and URLs we're using to ensure that we can use the same keys and same URLs once we push our app onto a server. Now let's start here on the backend. There, I got a couple of values which I might want to swap between development and production. Most importantly, if we go to the app.js file, there we connect to MongoDB with a certain user, a certain password, and a certain database. Now, it's not unlikely that we might want to use a different MongoDB Atlas account here, a different database, so different values for our app that runs in production than we do for our app that we test locally. The database should definitely be a different one so that we don't interfere with the data of our real users if we then continue working on the app locally in development. So if we then add new features, add new dummy data, and we mess with the database our real users are writing to as well. We don't want to do that. So it would be nice if these values, username, password, and also the database name, would be kind of variable. And depending on whether we run this locally or on a real server, we insert different values there. Now, thankfully, that is something we can do without too much effort. Locally here, I am using NodeMon, right? We're starting app.js with NodeMon. Now, we can add a nodemon.json file to provide some configuration to NodeMon. Now, you can check out NodeMon's docs to learn all about the configuration values you can provide there. This should be a JSON format, and here, I'm interested in the nth key which we can set up there, nth for environment. And there we can set up so-called environment variables. These are variables, variable data, which depends, or where the values depend on the environment you're running in. And you can refer to them in your code, and therefore, based on the environment your code is being executed in, you will be using different values in your code. Env in the NodeMon config takes an object, and now there you can have any names, any keys of your choice. For example, db user. You don't have to write it like this. This can be any name of your choice. And then you enter the value here. So here I will actually stick to this value, and I will use Academind here as a user, and hence enter this here between double quotes on the right side as a value. I will also store my password here with db password. And then here, go back to app.js and grab that password and copy that into nodemon.json. And then also the db names, so the database name. Here, I will use MERN because that is the value I'm using here too. Now, these are my development values. You might wonder, where do we enter the values we want to use in production, so when our app really runs on a server? Well, that depends on the hosting provider you're using in the end. If you're using some service that does all the general setup for your application, as we will do later, then this service will give you an easy-to-use way to provide such environment variables. And I will come back to that once we really move our application onto such a real server. So you will later see how to configure values for the production mode as well. These are our development mode values, and now we just have to refer to them in our script, of course. Now here, I'm already setting this connection string as with backticks so that I can dynamically inject values. If you're not doing that, make sure you do so. And with that here, we can inject a value instead of the hard-coded username. We have to refer to process.env and then the name of your environment variable. So in my case here, db user. This process.env thing is something Node.js provides to you. There is a global process variable, which is always available. It has an nth key, and this gives you access to the environment variables that are injected into the running Node.js process. And NodeMon injects these values, and as I mentioned later, when we run this on a server, different values will be injected. So with that, we can refer to a value for the user, here then also for db password, and then here at the end, instead of this hard-coded database name, it's db_name, which I chose here in NodeMon.json. So with that, we're injecting dynamic values here. Now on the backend, I got two other things I could inject. And that for one is in the util folder, my Google API key here. We might always want to use that. In that case, we could also hard code it here. But if we want to use a different key for local development and for running this in production, which is not unlikely, then we might want to inject this here or get this from our environment variables as well. So here we could then refer to process.env Google API key, or however you want to name it. And now you just have to provide such an API key here in nodemon.json. Now the concrete value is something I will come back to because I want to tweak that API key or at least have a look at it in the Google Developer Console before we actually use it again. So I'll just enter a placeholder here. We'll take care about the actual value soon. And one other last place I want to replace with an environment variable on the backend here is my private key for the JSON web token. In the user's controller, when we create a web token, I use this private key here, right? Now we can definitely hard code it into this file like this, but of course keep in mind that we are reusing it multiple times. We're using the same key here in sign up and then also here in our check off middleware. Hence, alone from the code reusage perspective, it would make sense to outsource this or to store this in an environment variable. So here I will add the JWT key and store my key in there without the single quotes. And of course, this can be any string you want. And again, you could be using a different string for local development than you do for production. This might be a good idea because if you push your local development code to GitHub or to some public repository, you might want to ensure that you're not using keys here, which you also use in production. Though if you are pushing your data to a public repository, you might in general not want to include this entire nodemon.json file in the repository because it contains a lot of confidential data. But if you would push it, it's still better to have different values for development than you do have for production, so that at least your production environment is safe. Well, and now with that, we can again inject this JWT key. So in check off here, where I need that key, I can use process.env.jwt key. And of course, do the same in the user's controller whenever we use that private key. So here in sign up, and also if we scroll up a bit, that was login. Also if we scroll up a bit here in sign up now. Now with this, if I start that, I get an error, db name. Yeah. Here in my connection string, of course, it always has to be process.env.environment variable name. So with that fixed, if I now start this, it should start again. It should connect to the database. That should all be working. And with that up and running, let's next have a look at the front end before I then also come back here to this Google API key thing.